Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by my good friend, Dr. Philip Chase. Philip, hello, how are you?
Hello, AP. It is wonderful to be here, and I think we have a very interesting topic in store for your viewers.
Well, I know you think it's interesting because you have just done a video on the thing that we're going to be talking about, which is prose in fantasy. Not fantasy prose, as in people who make a profession out of it, but the words on the page, because you did a great video on Le Guin's From Elfland to Poughkeepsie, which, to my mind, is one of the cornerstones that forms the foundation of fantasy analysis. There's Le Guin's From Elfland to Poughkeepsie and Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. These are two of the core essays, text, lectures that formed the basis that kick-started a lot of the research and thought into what fantasy is doing and how we think about it, how we conceptualize it. And it's a great video. I greatly enjoyed it, but I thought we can dig a little bit deeper here because it's related to a lot of different concepts. And it ties into, obviously, one of the things that I love talking about, which is, analysis of what prose is doing in these texts. So, with all that being said, and I know it was me rambling for a bit there, can you summarize? I recommend people go and actually watch Philip's video, but just the key point that you were trying to get across with that video.
Sure, yeah. So, standing on the shoulders of giants, here we are. Le Guin's essay, I think, as you say, it is as important as you indicated because she addresses the idea of style is really the word she used. I kept using the word prose, and I know there's a difference between prose and style, and you certainly know the difference, but she uses the word style in the essay, and she wanted to address right there in the title, I think it sort of says it, From Elfland to Poughkeepsie. And the idea being that fantasy is a genre that is a bit different from other genres in the sense that it is much more archetypal. It is much more deals with forms and issues that might be typically seen in myth and in legend and that sort of thing. And I think that's not, everyone kind of knows that. But that being the case, the prose style of a fantasy, and she really, when she says fantasy, I think she really means epic fantasy, but it needs to match that in the sense that when you are a fantasy writer, you are creating a world. And for that world to feel believable, to be immersive, you need to craft it with words that indicate to the reader, this is not our world. This is not Poughkeepsie, right? This is Elfland. And the perilous and the wondrous things that happen in Elfland, they don't happen in Poughkeepsie. So that's an important thing that you as the writer need to be aware of, because if you have dialogue, for example, and she does focus on dialogue in the essay, if you have dialogue that feels like your neighbors talking or the people at the supermarket or whatever in our mundane, ordinary world, you're going to ruin that effect. You're going to pull your reader essentially out of your fantasy realm into the mundane. And that is not going to serve your story. So fantasy and the style, she says, and it's an interesting point, is the story in some ways. It isn't just some accessory to the story. It's not one ingredient in the cake. It is the cake. So it's an interesting point that she makes there, which we can talk about. And a couple things that I diverged just to finish this off. I did indicate that she talks about the tightrope. So the tightrope being, you have to navigate as a fantasy writer. There's on the one side the peril of overdoing the archaic stuff and the these and the thous and the withers and all that and the whences. And so you need to, obviously it becomes laughable if you overdo that. It becomes a parody of itself. Yeah. So on the other hand, though, as I was talking about, you don't want it to feel too contemporary. You don't want it to feel like our world, because it's not going to be, you're going to pull your reader out of the story that way. So in between, there is this prose style that serves the story, that is removed. It doesn't necessarily have to be archaic, but it is in some ways removed from our ordinary world. And I just thought that maybe that tightrope could change with time, because she gives an example which I actually thought was way too archaic in E.R. Edison's prose. And I thought she held it up as a good example of walking the tightrope. And I thought, no, not now. So I just sort of postulated that maybe this tightrope moves with time. And also I wanted to add that there are a lot of other subgenres within fantasy where contemporary prose might be appropriate. For example, urban fantasy. Maybe you could argue for YA, that sort of thing. So, Dresden Files is in Chicago. So Butcher needs to use contemporary sounding dialogue, unless it's some elf queen talking or something. So yeah, that's the gist of it, I think.
And it's a very important point, because like one of the big things that goes to this is effect, the effect that is created by the prose. And that is something that I think we sometimes overlook when we talk about prose, because we do quite often separate prose out as, we want to talk about the prose, and then we want to talk about the characters, and then we want to talk about the scenes, and then we want to talk about the world building.
Yeah.
But one of the points that I've made previously is the prose is how the scene is set, the atmosphere is created, how the author reflects their tone, how characterization is communicated to the reader. The prose is the connective tissue that joins everything together and creates everything and gives it to the reader. And that is sometimes difficult to wrap your head around, because we like being able to separate things out. But ultimately, you always have to consider how they interrelate. And Le Guin is, I think, exactly right in saying it isn't the icing on the cake. It is the cake itself. How it is written, how it is communicated is the thing. Everything else are the elements that are in the thing being communicated. So I think that's a very essential element. And it comes down to the effect that an author wants to create. Because when we think of other genres, mimetic genres that are not fantastic, but if you think of detective noir, when you want to evoke a sense of that time and place, you can have the character talk about dames instead of women or ladies. And by using a word that has fallen out of fashion, it is so evocative of that time and place. Talking about speakeasies, or using what is now very, very archaic language, but it is language rooted in that time and place. So when you create a fantasy world, where is the language of a fantasy world rooted? And this is where you get this really interesting thing, and the tightrope that we're walking, and also your point that this changes over time according to reader preferences, reader knowledge, author knowledge. What are the prevailing trends in literature? How has writing changed over time? What has fallen out of favor? How language itself has changed. Because unlike a detective noir that is set in a certain time period, there is no time period here that exists that we go, we're lifting the language from here. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's the difficulty. And so there is a certain amount of subjectivity, I think, that goes into this discussion, because not only can the tightrope change with time, but I think that your tastes are different from mine. Mine are much better than yours, for example. So, no, I mean, sorry, jokes aside.
No, hang on a sec.
Yes.
Just so you're aware, remember, this is going on my channel.
Oh,
I get to edit this.
Oh, no.
Just warning you.
Uh-oh. No, you're not going to put one of your art pictures in there, are you? No.
Oh, please, carry on with your point.
Okay. So anyway, yeah, so it is a personal taste issue as well. I'm a medievalist. I like archaic language. I'm comfortable with archaic language. I know how to use, I know the difference between thee and thou. I like this stuff. So I might have much more stomach for archaisms in my fantasy than probably most people. So in addition to, yes, from era to era, the tightrope changes, I think that an individual brings their own sensitivities to the reading. So it becomes a tricky business for a fantasy writer then to say, okay, how much do where do you want, if you're going to err, are you going to err on the side of, too stylized, or are you going to err on the side of too colloquial? And it's a tough decision to make, I think, as a writer. It's a decision that writers in other genres don't need to make. And there might go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was about to say, in science fiction and horror, again, there are very specific language choices being made to create certain effects. And I've talked about cognitive estrangement, or in Tolkien's case, arresting strangeness.
Yeah.
That it's going to a very similar point about this effect that the author is trying to create. And
Right.
what I think is, to add to your point about this element of subjectivity about what is going to be the correct language for the story.
Right.
Not only is the time period important, the individual reader is so important to this, because when you have a very broad vocabulary, when you have a very extensive vocabulary, words typically don't seem odd and don't stick out to you. You will know a lot of what other people will consider obscure words or archaic words, and you won't think of them as obscure or archaic. You will think of them as relatively normal. Right. And even within different cultures or different areas in the world, words that you think of as perfectly normal words, in another part of the world, even if they are speaking exactly the same language, that word would be archaic, because it has fallen out of favor with that particular group. Be it, the difference between UK English and US English is a prime example of this. And then even within US English, when you think of East Coast, West Coast, when you think of the different styles of speaking and dialects that have evolved across the whole of the US, there are words in existence in certain parts of the US that when you hear it in a different part of the US, you go, that's a really old-fashioned word.
Yeah.
But for that person, it's not. It's a modern everyday word. And we have this as a problem all the time. When you're unfamiliar with something, it will stick out. And that causes quite a lot of readers to get pulled out of the narrative, to get ripped out of the narrative, and to lose that sense of immersion. So that is a massive aspect of this. So I think part of what Le Guin is talking about is, by deliberately choosing archaism, that you create a faux reality that is going to be slightly more immune to that than, say, if you were writing in a modern dialect, because a modern dialect is going to be much more culturally specific, but also seem less fantastical.
Right. Yeah, an interesting example of that subjectivity that you were just talking about. My favorite translation of Beowulf is Seamus Heaney's translation. Brilliant poet, Seamus Heaney was. And of course, he was Irish. And his translation is interesting because he does include some, and now I'm not sure if everyone in Ireland would recognize these words, but if they're just regional words or what, but.
Quite a lot of Ulster Scots, which is predominantly Northern Ireland.
So there you go. So you probably would recognize those words. So you're reading his translation of Beowulf. We're both reading his translation of Beowulf. I come across these dialect words from Ulster, and for me, they sound very exotic. They sound very foreign. They sound kind of cool. They work for me. You read these words and you're like, oh, that I know that word. You have a different experience of that translation as a result of your familiarity with those words. So it's an interesting example, I think.
We had the same thing that cropped up when we were talking about Malazan, and some readers were going, oh, ochre is overused. And you go, why are you complaining about the word ochre? Like, what's the big deal? You go, it's such a weird word. And you go, no, it isn't. It's a perfectly normal word. And again, it had to do with the context in which you knew it and whether you were familiar with it. And once it sticks out once, every time you see it, then it is going to stick out again. And, that's why we have these conversations. People say, oh, that word is overused.
Right.
You go, well, how many uses is a word allowed?
Yeah. But so in fantasy, where the author is using prose that indicates this is another world, there tend to be key words that the author will use, key phrases that signal this isn't our time or this isn't our world. And they don't have to be, but they often are archaic words. And we can talk about specific authors later on, I think. Now, you do have to be good at this, though. I think if you try to do it without knowing what you're doing, if you just go at it and throw in a bunch of these and thous and methinks and all that, it's going to be awful. It's going to be terrible. So you have to work at this, which leads to an interesting, I think, observation about this whole discussion. In a way, one of our viewers, and I say our because he's on your channel as well as mine all the time, made a very, I think, interesting observation about, is there an elitist element to Le Guin's argument, to insisting that good fantasy prose is like this, not like this? Is that a bit of gatekeeping, perhaps, in a sense? Or, it becomes a difficult issue in that sense, because I'm sympathetic to Le Guin's argument. I want there to be high standards for great fantasy. But at the same time, am I saying, if you don't write with this prose style, then you're not a good writer? I don't think I'm saying that, but...
No, I don't think that's what Le Guin's argument is, because Le Guin's argument is focusing on, in order to create the effect of a fantasy world, she is saying you use a certain register, you use a certain lexical set, and as you point out, that changes over time. Like, a very simple example of this would be, if you look back at, say, 19th century works.
Yeah.
And we look at the standard English used there, they do not use contractions anywhere near as often as we do. We do not do that. We cannot do that. We should not do that.
Right.
We don't do that. We shouldn't do it. We won't, we use contractions. Contractions are a modern part of English. Now, if you have a knight on horseback with a lance in full plate, and it's meant to be evocative of the medieval period, and he goes, I'm not going to do that, you big Chad.
Yeah. Right.
And you go, oh, the knight just called someone a Chad. What? You can see how that can be jarring. Now, can an author do that knowing it is going to be jarring? Of course, because if they are aware of the effect, and that's what Le Guin is talking about. She's talking about, if you want to create this effect of a fantasy world that feels fantasy, to evoke the fantastic, Tolkien's arresting strangeness, you focus on words that are going to create that within your dialect. You can reach for more archaic constructions. You would probably get rid of a lot of contractions. You would probably use slightly different grammar, more formal grammar, to elevate the register, to make it distinct to modern day. But then you can have someone come along and go, no, but I want the everyday soldier to be much more like today, and only the nobles speak in elevated language. Where have I come across that before? Would that be Shakespeare? Using the different registers to create that stratified effect. And it's about the effect created. And because as time moves on, as language moves on, as literary tastes change over time, what you deem archaic is always going to get bigger. And what is modern is always going to be a small set. And so there's a wider and wider choice behind you each and every time. But for Le Guin, if she looked at, say, some of the modern fantasy that was written today and looked at it, she might say it would feel very strange to her because language has changed. But she would still be able to appreciate that these were fantasy worlds that were being created.
Yeah. So she gives an example in the essay, which is, by the way, 1973. So that's probably important. It's nearly 50 years old. She gives an example in the essay of a fantasy work that was written in about that time, and she plays a little trick where she takes out the proper nouns and just substitute them with modern day proper nouns. So instead of, I don't remember the specific names, but they were fantasy sounding names, right? Both place names and personal names. And she puts in, modern names like Smith, or Poughkeepsie or whatever, and changes nothing else. And you as a reader, you don't blink at that. You say, okay, other than those fantasy sounding names, there's nothing in this prose to indicate that this is a different world, that this is Elfland. And so she gives this as a bad example, or an example of what she's trying to tell people not to do. That is to say, don't use prose that feels like it could be just written in a modern novel about contemporary times, because you're not going to succeed in transporting your reader to Elfland that way. So it's an interesting thing that she does, and it's a fairly convincing little trick.
But there's an interesting way to think about this. Think of portal quests, things like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Yeah.
When you have the section in the real world, in the mimetic reality,
Right.
you can use what you think of as contemporary language, and you set up everything that way. And then when you move into the fantasy realm, if you choose a different register, you create this brilliant contrast between the two, which makes the fantastic seem more fantastic and makes the mundane seem more mundane.
Exactly.
So now take that concept and go, right, well, okay, so it's a portal quest. Now, if I start my story when they're already in fantasy, oh, look, that's the language I'm using. That's another way of thinking about it, the language being evoked here. Now, we have a lot of authors, and what one of the techniques is throwing in the odd fantasy word now and again, or throwing in something like that, because that is enough to create the impression of the fantastic.
Or your favorite technique of putting an apostrophe in the name.
I don't know why that became a thing. But naming is actually a fascinating one. Is it the Tiffany problem about Terry Pratchett? And they said that Tiffany was this name, like, oh, it's far too modern a name. And you go, well, actually, it has its roots in medieval, blah, blah, blah. Or someone else going, oh, this name, that's a really modern name. That shouldn't be in this fantasy world. That's too modern for this. This is the same issue that we're talking about here, just seen from a different perspective, where there is a perception that a word is too modern. And then you can have things, we've talked about this before, of words that come from a specific etymology in our own language, that someone says, but that event did not happen in the secondary world, so how can they have an Achilles heel?
Right. Yeah.
And it throws some people out of the narrative.
It breaks the immersion for some people.
But a lot of other people go, yeah, but what else are you going to call it? Because if you called it, oh, it's a flurble heel, then you're going to have to explain what a flurble heel is to the reader to give them context. Because if you say Achilles heel, everyone knows what you're talking about. If you say a flurble heel, they go, well, what's a flurble heel?
Right. Yeah.
Oh, he had a flurble heel, did he? Oh, that must be terrible. Has he been to the doctor? And this tightrope that fantasy authors sort of have to walk. A novel, for the most part, novels have to be read by a contemporary audience. That's who an author is writing for. And they write for the contemporary audience. Therefore, they are writing to be appreciated in this time. They're not writing to be appreciated 50 years ago, and they're not writing to be appreciated in 100 years. Most of them. I think some people do have that element. Yes, my work will be read 100 years from now.
Yeah.
But they're writing for a contemporary audience. They have learned their craft in contemporary time periods. Therefore, they are influenced by contemporary writing.
Yeah.
And so you can see why all of these techniques, why the base language is going to shift over time, because someone taught creative writing in the 1950s, was taught with a whole series of different examples and different rules and different techniques to evoke different things than someone taught in 2010. 60 years later, that the base that you're learning from, you might have one or two of those examples, but you're going to be looking at a lot more modern examples. You're going to be looking at different things. And then you're going to be influenced by the books that you read, the new books coming out, the ones that are only slightly like a decade old, or the really old books that are 60 years old, and you go, oh, back in the 1950s when they would have been considered contemporary.
Yeah, it is something to think about when you're a writer. I suppose you can't obsess over this because you can't predict it, but to a degree, some writing ages better than others. And there are multiple reasons for this, but just on the level of prose, the two examples that I talked about in the video that I did that Le Guin gives as both being positive examples, the E.R. Edison and the Tolkien example, of the two, it's just, I think, obvious to just about anybody that the Edison example has not aged very well. Whereas the Tolkien example, at least to my ears, has done just fine. And so it's interesting because both of them do Edison much more than Tolkien. Both of them do use language that is just made up, that never existed. It's interesting because a lot of these writers who use archaisms in their prose, like William Morris, for example, or Lord Dunsany. These are the you make a list of the worst in terms of using, just way overdoing the archaic stuff. You'll see very quickly, though, that they use language that never existed anywhere. It's a pseudo language. It's there on their world. It's there on their page. And it's just, the only problem with it is that it's overdone. And it to the point where I think most modern readers would really struggle to read William Morris's prose romances, is what they were called at the time. Yeah.
But we've also seen a lot of modern readers have problems with Tolkien. It sounds, to a lot of ears, Tolkien sounds very old-fashioned.
Right.
His style of writing is old-fashioned.
Partly because he wrote in an archaic style, partly because time has moved on, and even the standard everyday sort of writing it seems aged from the 1950s now, I would guess, right?
And there are a lot of different elements to that. But when we think of even one of the things that actually figures into this, if we think of the structure of modern narratives, structures have changed. There's a lot of focus, particularly on action and things happening, and this style of exposition and how that is relayed to the reader and how much is included and length of chapter and all of these things play into it. So while Le Guin is talking about prose, obviously a lot of that is actually, she's actually discussing style, and style is impacted by a lot of different things, structures, pacing, all of these different elements. And it's not that Tolkien's pacing was bad.
Right.
The model for Tolkien's pacing is not the model that is currently popular.
Right.
And therefore, when you read it now, it doesn't feel like a modern novel, because it's not a modern novel. It's old. It's operating within a different paradigm. And, so much of this is interconnected. And that's why it is very difficult to tease all of this apart, because we can use fantasy terms, made up terms, absolutely out of the box. Erickson using warrens to describe the type of magic. Sanderson using allomancy. Allomancy, made up word. But based on a route that makes sense to us, because oneromancy, necromancy, technomancy, which made up by Gibson. But because they're all using the same route, you can see the extrapolation, and it makes sense to us. It feels real, even though it never existed in real life, because there were things that existed in real life that were using that construction, and then these authors have altered them to create something that feels kind of real, but isn't real.
So they're engaged in sub-creation. But there are exceptions to, and Le Guin doesn't really address this, but I tried to a little bit in my video, but there are exceptions, because not only does the era change, the taste of the era change, but also there are different forms of fantasy. There's satire. You mentioned Terry Pratchett earlier. Terry Pratchett uses, from what I can tell, a much more contemporary kind of prose style. And that fits with the satirical comedic thing that he's trying to do. And if he does use archaic language anywhere, my guess is he's doing it for satirical reasons, and he'll probably deliberately overdo it.
But in 30 years' time,
Yeah.
Pratchett will be viewed as very old-fashioned, and
Huh.
people in 30 years' time may have the same sort of problems reading Pratchett that some readers today have reading Tolkien, even though it is satirical and it's meant to be parodic, because by that stage the base norm will have changed so that they won't recognize the parody in the same way that we do. But
Mm.
there was a word that came up in discussion, and it was when I was discussing cognitive estrangement and arresting strangeness,
Uh-huh.
and the word was widdershins. And of
Uh-huh.
course,
Yeah.
Pratchett uses the term widdershins in a lot of the Discworld novels.
Yeah.
And this commenter was saying, it's a really weird word. And I'm like, no, it isn't. It, it it's not something I would typically say to my mum and dad, but
Right.
it's not so random a word that I have never heard it before. It's not so strange I've never heard it before. It's an old-fashioned word. Like I recognize it.
Yeah.
I've read it in a lot of different contexts.
Right.
But because it was so weird to the reader,
Interesting. Yeah.
they had a problem with it. Whereas I'm looking at going, no, but it's just a slightly old-fashioned word because it is more commonly used in this part of the world.
Right.
Even though it is slightly old-fashioned, but for them it was, oh, this is going back to days of yore. Yea, verily, did it rotate widdershins.
Yeah, William Morris loves that word, widdershins. He uses it a lot. But go ahead.
Well, no, I was just saying, so there is this, and again, part of it is education and your vocabulary.
Yeah.
But so much of that is culturally dependent, and so much of it is geographically dependent, and so much of it is temporally dependent. When you grew up, what you were exposed to, what other language you speak. If you speak French and English, when you see Latinate-derived words, because you speak French, they are actually easier to decode. If you speak German, when there are Anglo-Saxon words that are being manipulated to create things, that can be much more recognizable. If you speak Greek and you see Greek-derived words that are being worked in,
Yeah.
it changes your appreciation of what is archaic and what is not.
Right. So a couple other exceptions that I mentioned in thinking about this, besides satire, would be the urban fantasy and the YA, possibly for slightly different reasons, though. Obviously, with urban fantasy, you are trying actually to capture a contemporary sound. So that seems sort of self-evident. And until the hero, the protagonist, whatever, goes into another world and encounters, creatures from another world, then maybe you want to use a slightly elevated or different style. But for the most part, if you're trying to evoke Chicago, you need to evoke Chicago. You need to use a more contemporary style. But
that's the point. That's the point that Le Guin was making, because as soon as you go into fairy, as soon as you go in Butcher's Never Never, if you had Titania or one of the high fairy lords or ladies speaking like an everyday New Yorker or an everyday member of Chicago or an everyday person from Belfast,
then it's satire.
That suddenly would be very, very jarring. And so there's a faux archaism and faux formalism applied to those things to make them seem more fantastic. But we talk about different registers. Like you can talk about very, very formal language. So if you think that, going back to discussing, say, RP and received pronunciation. And thinking about newscasters. And if you look at news reports from the 70s and 80s, particularly in the UK, they had a very formal way of speaking. But then over time, they realized, well, no, let's represent the viewership more in the people who are actually giving the news, reading the news. And that's when we start getting regional accents being broadcast. But like those old-timey radio producers in America that had a completely made-up accent that did not actually exist in the US, but it was one they all used because they went, it's kind of in between all these other ones, and that's the style that they used. But we speak in different registers. When we are speaking to authority and we're being very, very formal, we use different sentence constructions. We would perhaps use fewer contractions.
Right.
When we are speaking to our family, we might have a different way of speaking. When we're speaking to our friends, when we're speaking to our boss at work, we
Mm,
don't always use exactly the same language. We code switch.
yeah.
And people do that a lot in a lot of different situations because they're trying to fit into a particular culture. And this is built into a lot of social situations. And
Hmm.
when you think of that code switching, when you think of the different registers we use for these situations, and then think about, right, well, if I'm going to try and create a fantasy world, what effect am I trying to create? It's simply another set to add to that code switching.
Yeah. Yeah, I think all authors, and maybe especially fantasy authors, need to be aware of code switching for sure. If you have a noble character, that character is going to have different speech patterns than a working class character. I do wonder about YA though, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, because I think the YA fantasy writer has maybe even a worse problem in a way, because yes, you want to evoke that foreignness, that exotic, that strange world in which the reader hopefully is going to be immersed. But one assumes that if you're writing deliberately YA, you're trying to write in a way that is accessible for a certain audience, and that audience might not yet have the tools to understand more formal or more archaic types of language. So the YA fantasy author, I think, is presented with a bit of a sticky situation. Le Guin doesn't talk about that at all, but A Wizard of Earthsea was supposedly written for kids. I don't actually agree with that designation, but in the time that it was published, it was billed as not, they didn't have a YA category back then,
Mhm.
but fantasy was just sort of lumped into, oh, it's for kids, in those times. But she
I
wrote
think
it
I
with,
told you that story before about when I was a child being bought a book on
yeah,
Celtic mythology. That,
yeah, yeah,
oh, it's just fairy tales. That's fine for this young child.
yeah.
No.
Yeah, that's content even, but just even in terms of the prose style, I don't think most kids would even have an easy time reading Wizard of Earthsea.
But
So
I think that's more to do with the fact that the Wizard of Earthsea would seem old-fashioned because there are multiple techniques that authors can deploy
yeah,
to not make the fantastic mundane, but to make the fantastic the base reality. And obviously, like one of the techniques is you can introduce a fantastic element, and then in the next paragraph,
yeah,
find a way to contextualize it so that the reader is introduced to, oh, this is weird, this is strange, I don't know what, oh, it's explained it, oh, now
right,
I understand it. And it creates ease in the reader that you can use and this would be a structural approach to the
right,
introduction of fantastic elements. So you don't necessarily have to completely alter the prose and the lexicon that you're using or the register that you're using, but
yeah,
you can add in additional paragraphs of exposition or have a character who's a fish out of water who things are being explained to. And
yeah,
when you do that, that's one of the ways that you can explain away the difficult concepts that has nothing to do. You can still use exactly the same archaisms, but what you
hmm,
would, I think, a lot of YA authors then think of, well, I have to write in a mode and a style that my target audience is going to be comfortable with. Now,
right,
if that is my baseline, how do I evoke the sense of the fantastic? How do I create that effect that Le Guin is talking about? Because for an adult audience, I may go, right, you know what, I can change the whole baseline.
right. To give a
But
perfect example, Tolkien writing The Hobbit versus Tolkien writing Lord of the Rings. Very different style. There's, same world, very different style, geared toward a different audience in a sense. And in The Hobbit, Tolkien will directly address the reader, kind of wink at the reader. We'll have the narrator do that. We'll use things that would seem anachronistic in Lord of the Rings, right? Like the tea kettle or whatever, he did keep some of those elements in Lord of the Rings as well. He has, them smoking pipes and stuff like that. But The Hobbit it has a language that is much closer to the language of Tolkien's day than Lord of the Rings does. So
Yeah, and you can see how it, again, while Le Guin's essay remains thought-provoking because
yes,
it is addressing how is this aspect of the fantastic being evoked? How is this effect being created? And what
right,
we've seen in a lot of modern fantasy, authors discovering and using different techniques to create the same thing.
yeah,
We recently discussed othering and placing the other sort of at the center of the text so
right,
that the reader is experiencing othering is a way of defamiliarizing the reader with their predominant viewpoint that they would have expected, which creates a fantastic effect that can then be utilized. And N.K. Jemisin does that.
yeah,
So there are different ways of evoking. It's not just language, but again, if you had, and it depends on the effect being created, but a character in Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive
right,
using very modern day slang or
mm,
reminiscent of modern day slang, and you have the character of Lift. How she speaks, how she acts is
mhm,
unlike all of those other characters.
mm.
And if you noticed, Lift is not one of the most universally loved characters.
Yeah, I've noticed that. Yeah,
A lot of that has to do with the register in which she speaks. Other people love it. They love the fact that she's different, that she's a breath of fresh air in that story.
yeah,
But you can see that Sanderson is using that sort of more modern vernacular and that attitude and the version of the street urchin to set her apart from the more formal reality of the Knights Radiant, from the more formal reality of these various courts and nobles. That Lift is different, and he uses a different register to give her that uniqueness.
yeah,
And we can then contrast her against, say, another street urchin who appears, who is much more like the nobles, but is using dumbed down language or makes grammatical errors to show their lack of education. These techniques to equate education with caste level, or
mhm,
social strata. The most well-educated, oh, they're the upper class. The least educated, well, they're the dumb commoners. We see that being played out. And of course, Shakespeare did that.
oh
Again, we're
yeah,
coming back to all of these techniques that are well established, that have been used time and time again, but we're seeing them deployed in different ways to create different elements of the fantastic,
yeah,
because it's about how they're being used and what effect they will create, not necessarily this is how you write fantasy. Like,
it
even
goes,
looking at the shelves behind me, and this
yeah,
is predominantly epic fantasy, but
mm,
they don't all write the same way.
yeah, absolutely. Shakespeare did it. Chaucer did it as well. In fact, Chaucer might have been one of the first in Western Europe to
To
do
use the
this,
vernacular.
to use the vernacular for certain characters. So the Knight's Tale is told in a register that is very formal, right? Whereas the Miller's Tale is full of vulgarity and all kinds of, just, much more crude language. So Chaucer was actually quite notable for this. Whereas if you look at Boccaccio, who was a little before him, he told a similar kind of frame narrative tale with everybody telling stories, but everybody's voice sounded the same
Yep.
in the Decameron. So it's interesting how Chaucer was one of the first that I know of to really exploit this difference. So very interesting.
It's fascinating because it's moving from aspects of storytelling being formal storytelling, and
Yeah,
here is I am now a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. This is the story I am about to lay before thee. Very formal sort of rhetoric being used to evoke story, and then
right.
going, no, but if I can create an effect by contrasting that with a character that uses slang.
Right.
And you can see, as long as you're aware of the effect, that it can be played with. And that's what I think we see in this in the postmodern approach to storytelling, It's
Mm.
no longer thinking there has to be one mode to do it. It's thinking
Right.
of all of these different disparate elements and tools and how we can manipulate them, how we can use them, how we can implement them to create contrasting effects.
Right.
And it's how I think a lot of literature has actually changed sort of in that intervening time period.
Right. Absolutely. And an author who does it really well is Stephen Erickson. He has a incredible range in terms of his style. And he does comedic characters. He does characters of all various classes. He does characters from various cultures. And never do I feel like I'm in Poughkeepsie. It's pretty incredible, actually, the range that you see there. But I think there are lots of authors who do this, what Le Guin is advocating. I think we could compile a list, and it would be personal to some extent, but I do think that it's pretty obvious that somebody like Stephen Erickson does it really, really well. Robin Hobb does it really, really well. Guy Gavriel Kay, I think in Tagana, at least that's the only one I've read by him, but I think he does it pretty well. I'm sure you have your own list, but there's quite a few authors in modern fantasy who are not putting us in Poughkeepsie. They're putting us in, Elfland, or their version of it anyway.
But to go back to Sanderson for an example, so
Yeah.
Hoyd as a character,
Yeah.
when Hoyd is in one narrative and is speaking a certain way, when Hoyd is the character himself in a different aspect of the narrative, or Hoyd is in a different narrative, there are differences to how he speaks and acts. Because again, it's code switching is probably the easiest way to explain it, that he is fitting in with the culture in which he is surrounded, but then switches depending on what culture that is. And we can see so many different authors use this. So I don't think, I think the initial point that we started with was, obviously there is a tension. There's a tension between something being too mimetic, too mundane, too like the real,
Right.
that can create an estranging effect that throws you out of the fantastic narrative and ruins immersion. But
Right.
that can happen lots of different ways.
Mhm.
But even an author who is well aware that that language will do that can implement it in a fantasy text because they know that is what the effect is going to be. So they
Right.
give it to a character that is meant to do that. And suddenly you can see, because the author is aware of the effect, they know how to manipulate the effect. So it's no longer about the language you're using, it's about how you're using the language. And that would be my major disagreement, if I have any, really, with Le Guin's perspective. But it still goes to the point that she was making. It's about the effect being created, about how you use the language to create that effect. So in essence, I agree with Le Guin.
Yeah.
And when Tolkien talked about arresting strangeness, the use of fantasy terms, the use of a fantasy element to stop you, to make you take in the wonder of this fantasy world, we can see that that's tied to exactly the same concept.
Yep. Absolutely. Yep. The perils of being a fantasy author.
Well, as long as they keep trying and keep, writing them, we'll keep reading them.
I think we will. Yeah.
And I think one of the great things to sort of focus on, or one of the things actually to bear in mind, when fantasy is written in a time period, I know it is very popular to say, oh, death of the author, and I don't need to consider the author, and I don't need to considering, okay, don't consider the author's intention, but consider the time period in which it was written, and bear that in mind when you are reading it, because what we assume as a base level norm of what language is almost guaranteed to be different if you're going back 40 years. Or if the author was English and you are an American, or if the author was Nigerian and therefore was using a different form of English. These things can actually have a very important impact on the narrative.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They can make or break it, really. They're the cake, right? So, yeah.
But all of this is basically to say the prose is really important. Stop treating it as a separate element. That, oh yes, I liked the prose. The prose was fine. No, let's talk about the really exciting bits. You're like, no, no, the prose, the prose.
No prose, no story.
But Philip, Thank you very much for joining me for this. This has been a lot of fun, and I hope other people have found it as entertaining as we have, even if they haven't found it educational.
Well, it might just be both. We might have just walked our own tightrope there, AP.
Into edutainment.
Hey, there you go.
Thank you very much, Philip. And for those of you still watching, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you in the next one.